Hello, beautiful community. What is the West's strategy in supporting Ukraine beyond just getting Ukraine to the next stop? Like, what's the vision for the future? What's the vision for the wider European space after the war? That's a question that's come in from Miho on Patreon, but it's a question that comes in a lot. So we're going to give it another very brief and casual go now, because it's connected not just with what happens after the war, but it's connected with how the war goes and how the war ends. Because, the way we talk about a very important situation, especially if these are discourses mediated by institutions we share, has an impact on the outcome of big events in the world. So Miho is asking, I've been struggling with one big issue that I see in the West, and that is an apparent lack of long-term political planning. Ukraine and Russia are the best example of that. Except the help that we're giving to Ukraine not to be defeated in the war, as opposed to Ukraine winning, nothing else seems to be done. Even donations of military equipment seem to be just in direct response to the current situation on the battlefield. So this is more pronounced with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this lack of planning. There's absolutely a lack of motives of planning toward a post-war Russia as well. Am I seeing this wrongly? And there's other questions basically asking the same thing about the West's strategy and Russia's strategy. So let's say two things. We got to be slow before we begin sort of mocking the positions of countries and their foreign policies. We've got to understand the complexity of Western democracy stabilizing itself around anything. And as critical as we can rightly be of potentially lack of strategy with the way we're supporting Ukraine, the way we're supporting Ukraine is incomparably more constructive and creative than most government policy. I mean, if the same kind of commitment and dedication and innovation was applied to public health policy, for example, in the United States or in the UK, you'd have incredibly different outcomes for quality of life for different citizens. So we've got to be clear that Western countries are doing a lot and they are making progress, and we shouldn't just mock the leaders of France or Germany when we disagree. Now, but this is an absolutely central thing that at the level of discourse I think is not being understood. That a post-war strategy is not something for the post-war period. A post-war strategy is among the things that decides who wins the war and how. So if I want to take anything away, it's that the way we talk about where we want this story to go affects what happens. Yeah, we could get a different outcome if we say we're committed to a rapid Ukrainian victory than if we say, we're going to see what we need to do to put Ukraine in a better place a couple of months from now, and then we're going to see what that means, and then after that we'll do the same and then see what that means. That'll get us a different outcome potentially. So a post-war conversation, right, isn't about what happens post-war. It directly affects how the war goes. So let's put a couple of simple things on the table here. First of all, in terms of the actors involved, some of the actors involved. So let's start with Russia. Mr. Putin is actually probably the only actor who has a clear long-term strategy here. And that gives him an advantage. His strategy is in the medium to long-term bound to fail because he's got an empire that has nothing to offer the world or its neighbors or indeed his own country. It's an empire that is convulsively self-terminating, and it's offering violence and it can extend and postpone and dramatize its self-termination or not. Right? So that means that Mr. Putin can have some good outcomes for a few years to come if things break for him and things go well for him, but in the end he'll still fall down. So what's his strategy with which he can have sort of short to medium term success if things go well for him? Well, it's roughly now the strategy of continuing to be committed to taking over all of Ukraine, continuing to be committed to, in some form or other, gaining proprietorial control over all of Eastern Europe. And how does he do that? Well, he freezes the war for now in some kind of a place, gets perhaps a kind of tacit acknowledgement that the bits of Ukraine he's nicked are anyway probably bits of the world that he is more passionate about than we are, so we might as well concede them to him. And that could get normalized, and then Mr. Putin can reconstitute while Western powers destabilize democratically, while Western leaders change, while a couple of Viktor Orbáns come to power in major Western countries, and then Mr. Putin is in a much stronger position to make further progress with his imperial adventure. So that's a strategy with a very high chance of failure. But it's a strategy, actually. And it's also predictable. Putin will not change with this, no matter how badly he does. So if Putin has a catastrophic experience with the Ukraine's counteroffensive, he won't change his strategy. So that's Putin. The elites that have got to the top of that regime in Russia are so physically, morally, and normatively feeble that they can't come up with anything. They're not going to propose anything. They are just tailing Putin and then seeing what happens. So what's left then of agents in Russia? Well, it's the Russian opposition. And the job of the Russian opposition is a job that they're struggling with at the moment, and that is to get that depoliticized blob in the middle in Russia to have the sense that there's a choice there for them. That they can go with Mr. Putin, but that there's also another path, and that they could choose it, and this is what to do to choose it, and this is where it'll go. And that's very important to do. It's hard to do, and at the moment the Russian opposition are really, really struggling with it, and the majority of the Russian population overwhelmingly feels there is no choice. Now Ukraine. Ukraine is in a very difficult situation because the only path that really positively makes sense for Ukraine is a path of some kind of Western integration. Ukraine does not have easy possibilities for alternate paths. So that's what Ukraine should aim for, and that's what is nevertheless a difficult thing for Ukraine to aim for, because Ukraine is not being told by the West, okay, you can win, or you can win as far as you can win, and then this is what happens. You're going to be joining NATO, or you're going to be joining the European Union. These are very distant possibilities. Right? Ukraine joining the European Union is a very distant possibility for Ukraine. And that is hard because Ukraine is feeling, well, come on, what are we fighting to align ourselves with? Can you give us some picture of our political future in the global scene, please, the West? And Ukraine is in this very difficult position that it's being given quite a lot of support, quite a lot of military support, but it's not being given, as it were, a space into which it can seek to sort of deliver itself via beaten Russia. The space that Ukraine is going to deliver itself after beating Russia, if it beats Russia, to whatever extent it beats Russia, is uncertain. So that's difficult. Now, I do think that the Ukrainian discourse about this needs to improve, right? And I think these are very serious questions for the Ukrainian regime as well. What's going to happen if and when Ukraine has to end in a compromise? A kind of compromise that the population isn't expecting, and a kind of compromise that the regime has not been sort of speaking around, right? Will the regime take ownership of that? Or will it be about just saying, well, no, it's not about us, it's because the Americans didn't give us enough weapons, and then this happened. So where am I driving with this? Ukraine's conversation about what it means for Ukraine to have a future, a real, meaningful, hopeful future, right? That conversation, I think, in a realistic sense, is not happening with enough depth and richness. And that's, to a good extent, inevitable, right? Because there is a bloody war on. But nevertheless, eventually, it is important to receive more pictures from Ukraine as part of Ukraine's conversation with itself about how Ukraine wants to envisage the European space in the future, how Ukraine wants to envisage the East European space in the future. And that kind of discourse also politicizes the region much more. It's a difficult situation for Ukraine, and none of this is made easy by the fact that what causes you to come together at wartime isn't necessarily a healthy way to come together in peacetime. So that's going to be really difficult transitions, and Ukraine is left in a kind of limbo about its post-war future, and it itself, though, can do more at the level of discourse, at least, about getting the country to talk to itself realistically about what it means for Ukraine to have an independent and hopeful future. Now, the West. What we're doing is reactive. We are saying that we're going to put Ukraine in a stronger position, and then what? Well, then maybe Ukraine does really well and kicks the Russians out, or maybe it puts itself in a better position as far as the negotiation goes. We're going to give Ukraine the chance to do as well as it can, then we're going to see. I don't give policy advice, but to make an understatement about this, there's healthy room for the Western approach to shift from propping up Ukraine into a stronger position to saying that, to getting closer at least, to saying that we're committed to maximizing the chances of a rapid Ukrainian victory. I think that it is in many ways a favor to Mr. Putin to remain as reactive as we are remaining. Now, what I think that we could talk about is how we, Westerners, Europeans, North Americans, Westerners includes Eastern Europe for me now, envisage the European space. So let's just sort of throw a couple of cents in the direction of that conversation. The Ukrainian public philosopher Andrei Baumeister likes to talk about a high-cost strategy. The strategy is that Russia should carry a high cost for what it's done. But he also thinks, and I'm just giving it as an example of Ukraine and proposing something concrete, not concrete but constructive. And I support that kind of proposal. And then he basically says we've got to tie this approach of a high cost consequence for Russia with a picture of how general principles of the international order come out of that. So we're not just saying Russia is going to bear a high cost, but we're going to say Russia is going to bear a high cost because these are the principles toward which we want our international politics to move. That means that if Russia made certain changes, it could be incorporated into that. That means that these principles also apply to the West itself, that if they involve certain ideas about the inviolability of sovereignty, the West is going to straighten its act out and be consistent in the way it hasn't been since, let's say, 2001 with its foreign interventions. Right? And it's not that we're developing some kind of philosophy of international relations here, but that we're developing a basic sense of overlap on do's and don'ts, right? That is then backed up by significant consequences and applies to all the countries that preach this stuff. I mean, so that's the beginning of a conversation about. You could begin to fill out the details of a proposal like that. But that's the beginning of a conversation about a post-war European space. And I'm afraid that at the moment, the tyrant in the Kremlin and the Russian opposition are not offering much toward this. Ukraine's put in a very difficult position where its future is uncertain, but its conversation with itself is also fraught and delimited. And the West is being reactive and is insufficiently engaging with a positive revisualization of the European space. And just to take one example, the more concrete we get about what we want Europe to look like, right? The more clear we are about how we're going to incorporate Ukraine into this, the clearer a message we send to Russians that there could be a choice there available for them and that there are different paths they can work toward. So clarity about a post-war future politicizes the situation much more and indeed politicizes things even in Russia. And the Russian space, bottom line, matters really much because what happens in Russia is going to affect the region. It's going to affect European security no matter what. So we've got to be realistic that if things continue going really badly on Russian soil, that's not good for European security at all. So, this is some of where it would be helpful to take our discourse. This was a bit rambly, but it's something we'll keep coming back to. I've been asked many times to comment on the leaks, and I think I will. I'll probably do that in the very next time we meet, probably tomorrow in the chat channel. That's enough for now.